From the headquarters of Talasio English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Soini Gray. The U.S. Ambassador to Ecuador, Todd Chapman, has said that with the change of ideology in the country, it was the appropriate time to develop military and security projects. Chapman spoke on the interest of the United States in training the police and military in Ecuador. He said, unfortunately, for a long time, some things were denied for ideological reasons, but now it is different. The former president, Rafael Correa, closed the U.S. base in Manta and ended the work of a military group in what he described as an act of sovereignty. Chapman says it's been discussed with the current government and he awaits a proposal to re-establish the military group. In a meeting moments ago, Ecuador's Interior Minister Cesar Navas says the country is facing a hard time on its northern border and is asking for more co-responsibility from the Colombian government. Ecuador is also signing on to bilateral agreements with the United States for the fight against transnational organized crime. Bakers in Argentina have been giving away thousands of kilos of bread outside Congress. They wanted to show how bakeries are suffering from mounting inflation as the government raises basic prices on basic services.
Outside Argentina's Congress, an endless line of people waits for a free loaf of bread. It's a reflection of the hard times so many people face as their paychecks don't last through to the end of the month.
Nobody's doing well. We are all going short. We are waiting for free bread because we have to pay rent. We can buy clothes like before. We can eat like before. The only person with plenty on the table is the president himself.
The bakers have had enough of the difficult situation they face. They came here to the city center to publicize their demands and gave away more than 5,000 kilos of bread.
Everything is going up. Gas, electricity, water, sugar, bread. We can't even eat a decent meal with our kids at the weekend. Does the president think this is okay? They brought vegetables here and everyone lined up. Now they're bringing bread, and that's good.
The protest was triggered by a fall in sales and a sharp increase in the prices of services and raw materials. A 50-kilo bag of flour has gone up by 50% in just 3 months.
We bakers are going through a really bad times, the worst in our history. We've never seen anything like this.
The bakeries are in crisis. We are suffering from the increases in service charges, and now we're worried about the increasing price of flour in recent weeks and the fall in sales. There are more than 40,000 bakeries in the country, and that means 400,000 jobs.
The bakers don't see any way out of the crisis. They are making zero profit and say they will keep protesting against a situation that could see 40,000 jobs lost in their industry.
Thousands of indigenous people in Brazil have marched through the capital and are now protesting in front of the Attorney General's office. They say a law signed by President Michel Temer last year will officially strike off the map most of the country's indigenous territory, and they're demanding that the law be revoked. Mia Alberti reports from Brasilia.
Are the 3,000 indigenous people participating here in the Freeland camp in Brasilia. Now for over an hour they have marched through the heart of the capital until where we are standing now, the office of the Attorney General. And they are demanding that they scrape a law that was signed by President Michel Temer last year, and they call that the genocide law. And they say that this law would wipe off the map almost all of the indigenous land here in Brazil. Now the decree that President Michel Temer has signed basically officializes a political and juridical debate that has been going on for years that says that one of the conditions for a land to be registered as indigenous is that it had to be registered by 1988, which was the year of the federal constitution. So think of this, in 2018, right now, there's 1,200 indigenous lands in Brazil, but only 30% of those are registered. Only 30% of those are registered now. So imagine how few were registered in 1988. So if this law stands and if this law goes ahead, what the indigenous groups are saying is that this would wipe off the map almost all of the indigenous lands here in Brazil.
Thank you for that report, Mia Alberti. Now, a commission in Rio de Janeiro will analyze the initial phase of the government-ordered military intervention in the state, as residents and social organizations report highly negative experiences, and they say they feel less safe.
Here in Rio de Janeiro, the work of the People's Popular Commission for the Truth has begun, which will investigate cases of abuses as well as crimes carried out during the federal military intervention here in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Today, the Commission will hold a meeting, its first meeting since the April 19th launch, in order to establish priorities for this Commission. Included in the priorities is an investigation into the assassination of Councillor Mariel Franco that occurred more than a month ago. Rio police have yet to name the murderers or the people who may have organized this barbaric act. The Commission will analyze how the army is being conducted on the ground. They've been accused of pestering poor neighborhoods and communities in the city. Residents and social movements have denounced human rights violations, and the Commission will look at the rise in crime, including robbery and murder. They'll have to look at the general rise in human rights violations carried out in these favelas, which are the poorest areas in the city of Rio de Janeiro.
We thank Andre Vieira for that report. Now, in Mexico, university students have taken to the streets to demand justice for the 3 film students murdered in the state of Jalisco.
Indignation over the murder of 3 audiovisual media students in the state of Jalisco was heard loud and clear on the streets of Mexico City. Students from several cinematography schools gathered to voice their anger at the murders of Daniel Diaz, Marco Garcia, and Salomón Aceves, whose bodies were discovered partially dissolved by acid.
It's a story that we all know very well. It's not convenient for the state to investigate deeper because, most probably, the state is involved in this matter and it's been covering up its dealings with the narcos. I don't think they are reliable.
They say that what happened to the students is unacceptable because they were simply filmmakers.
It's something that really scares us, because this is what we do every day. They were filming, they were working, and living in a country where you can do what you are passionate about. It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Since the 3 students disappeared last March in the district of Tonalá, more university students and lecturers joined protests.
We are demanding a hold on impunity, a cease to violence, a way to stop guns and war, and that they finally hear what we ask for. As a lecturer, as a filmmaker, I think this is a chance to remain together and to show all the anger that exists in our country against this brutality.
The case of the 3 film students is a consequence of the serious violent situation which Jalisco experiences every day. The West Mexican state has suffered disappearances in 118 districts out of 125.
And there have been demonstrations in Guatemala demanding the resignation of President Jimmy Morales. This move came after new evidence surfaced indicating that he received illegal electoral funding in 2015.
After the Public Ministry of Public Affairs determined that President Jimmy Morales was involved in electoral crimes, hundreds of indigenous groups from the Campesino Development Committee, CODECA, arrived in the capital to demand his resignation.
Jimmy Morales
is a political criminal. He has stolen education and health services from the people. We can't have criminals in the government. That's why we have taken the streets, because we are tired of being governed by criminals.
The Campesino demonstration got in front of the National Palace, Congress, and the Supreme Court of Justice. The demonstrators called for the businessmen involved to also face justice. They gave almost $2 million to the Morales campaign that were not reported to the Electoral Tribunal. The businessmen have confessed the unauthorized donation.
They are getting richer while there are a lot of poor people, and we are now in front of a building that actually belongs to us, the National Palace.
The country is in a similar crisis to that of 2015. Back then, it ended with the resignation of President Otto Pérez Molina. Campesino groups insist that new laws must be created to prevent corruption in the future.
What the Guatemalan people need is to get rid of all the corruption, or we are going after the National Constituent Assembly.
Following the accusations of illicit electoral funding, the Ministry of Public Affairs will request the Electoral Tribunal sanction the FCN Nación Party, which was the party that took Jimmy Morales to the presidency.
We'll take a short break now, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. The Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza, has stressed that the Venezuelan people will choose their president on May 20th without any type of international intervention. Arreaza made the remarks at a UN forum on peace in New York.
President Maduro, Henry Falcón, and other presidential candidates are campaigning across the country. Each one of them has different political ideas and economic proposals. But the Venezuelan people have the right to choose the best option for them. On May 20, the National Electoral Council will give the results of the presidential elections, and it will represent the will of the people. If the government loses, the ruling party will become the main opposition movement, and we will dedicate ourselves to getting back into power democratically and without violence.
Barbados still doesn't have its election date, even though Prime Minister Frondell Stewart has until only June 4th to hold the election. Earlier, I spoke to Peter Wickham of the Caribbean Development Research Services, CADRES. He said that the Barbadian Prime Minister's decision to let Parliament dissolve without setting an election date is a regional first. But he also says it holds the citizens in limbo and could be a bad political move. In fact, Wickham says Stewart's actions are highly unwise politically.
Generally, longer terms result in defeat. Prime Minister Stewart is now almost at the 63rd month of what should be a 60-year term. And generally speaking, it spells defeat. The polls are looking very bad for him. Strategically, it doesn't make sense, especially as Ms. Morley said, there's not anything that we can say that he's doing while he's there to make things better for him long term. So, I mean, we keep asking what is the strategy, and he keeps saying that he has the time legally, and really it's a question of his legal right and it's not a question of political strategy. So I draw a blank where that one is concerned as far as the strategy. I think it's highly unwise politically, and I think he will pay dearly for it.
Now, he may be the only one who knows the date, but Prime Minister Frondel Stewart is still campaigning. He was caught on social media on Tuesday in a walkabout in his district of Britain's Hill. Earlier this week, Stewart promised that Barbadians will soon be able to exercise their franchise in general elections. As we said, it's constitutionally due by June, but he stopped short of announcing the much-anticipated date.
There's a welcome. It says welcome.
Prime Minister Frondel Stewart there. In Chile, President Sebastián Piñera has withdrawn a bill that was expected to help victims of the Pinochet dictatorship.
It has been 45 years, and the victims from the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship have received no justice yet.
We can't ignore the massacre that happened here in Chile. Our family was taken as hostage and then murdered and disappeared. Almost 45 years later, no one can ignore what this dictatorship meant in Chile.
That's why the proposed bill was looking to guarantee, among other things, financial compensation.
Las víctimas de tortura en Chile son las más rezagadas en materia de violaciones a los derechos humanos durante la dictadura. Y lo que quisimos hacer durante el gobierno de la presidenta Bachelet, por cierto no alcanzamos a hacer todo, es acortar esa brecha. Y ese proyecto iba en esa línea.
But not anymore. President Piñera withdrew the controversial bill. He was cheered on by right-wing legislators like Ignacio Urrutia, who called the victims of the dictatorship terrorists. There's outrage from the victims and their families. Young members of the Communist and Socialist Party arrived at the headquarters of the Independent Democratic Union Party to demand actions against the legislator. The Minister of Justice tried to cool things off.
As we have said before, we have a commitment to maintain the policy of human rights and everything that goes along with the truth, justice, reparation, and reconciliation.
Gabby knows the pain very well. Her father disappeared and was one of the leaders of the talks with the military in 1999. They confessed to throwing his body to the sea, but this wasn't true.
He was found later in a military compound called Fuerte Arteaga, 25 years after his detention.
Juan Rivera, he was buried 3 times. He who came out of the sea to unmask the lie.
Unsolved mysteries that make the pain and the mistrust even bigger.
The authorities in Colombia have declared the area of Catatumbo as a zone of public calamity because of escalating violence between 2 armed groups. Violent clashes between the National Liberation Army, or ELN, and the Popular Liberation Army, or EPL, have caused more than 7,000 people to be displaced. The conflict has led to the closure of hospitals and businesses in the north of the country. Communities in the area are demanding that the government put an end to the human rights abuses. In the latest confrontation between these groups, the EPL has released a video which apparently shows that they're holding 6 people as hostages, who they claim are guerrillas of the ELN. The Colombian authorities say the video is genuine. The kidnappers belong to the Jose Manuel Martinez Quiros Front. The group is asking for an exchange of prisoners in order to release them. And the Colombian government's chief negotiator, Gustavo Bell, hopes to restart the peace talks with the National Liberation Army, or ELN, as soon as next week.
We are waiting for the ELN to clear up any doubts or concerns they have about the judicial process. We are hoping that shortly we'll be able to confirm the new venue where we can restart dialogues in the next few days. We hope it will be as soon as the beginning of next week, because we're working hard to achieve a ceasefire that will enable the political process to function normally with a legitimate peace deal.
Nurses in Antigua and Barbuda have protested outside the parliament over changes to the Mount St. John Medical Center Act. The nurses are contesting the wording of the legislation that suggests that they must reapply for their jobs at the Mount St. John's Medical Center Board after May 31st. There are fears that staff not absorbed by the board will face redundancy. The government amended the wording of the act before it passed through the parliament. Prime Minister Gaston Brown said it was never the intention to put the nurses in that situation.
What the initial drafters did is that they assumed that the individuals would remain with the public service and that they had the option to apply to the board. However, that was misinterpreted as though individuals would lose their employment. It's a fact. So, to make it abundantly clear, the language was changed. So, what will happen now is that they would be automatically transferred to Mount St. John, and then you now have the option to say whether or not you wish to stay with the public service. But fundamentally, it is the same thing.
We're going to take another short break, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. Another judge in the United States has ordered the Trump administration to restore the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. A judge in the District of Columbia, John Bates, described the decision to cancel the scheme as arbitrary and capricious. He also asked the government to accept new applications. 90 days have been given to the government to explain their decision to scrap the scheme. Two judges from New York and San Francisco had also ordered the authorities to keep the scheme going. In September of last year, President Donald Trump had announced the ending of the program, which lets young, undocumented migrants stay in the country. And our Washington, D.C. correspondent, Jorge Arreaza, has more on this decision.
This is the third judge to rule against Trump's move to end DACA, a federal judge from Washington, D.C., from the District of Columbia, where this city is. He says that canceled DACA was arbitrary, capricious, because the Department of Homeland Security failed adequately to explain its conclusion the program was unlawful. It has 90 days to appeal. That is the third judge. The two previous ones were from San Francisco and from New York, and most definitely the faith of about 800,000 students that are protected under DACA, called the Dreamers, are definitely still in limbo, but most definitely they're still having all the rights to stay and work and study in this country. We get back to you now.
We thank Jorge Arreaza for that report. U.S. President Trump and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron have discussed a possible new agreement on Iran's nuclear program. During their meeting in Washington, Macron suggested new negotiations aimed at curbing Iran's military power and activities in the region. The new deal will also include Iran's ballistic missile program and its role in Syria. Trump has called the existing Iran agreement the worst deal ever and has threatened to cancel it. And a prominent conservative politician among Iran's ruling elite, Mohsen Rezai, has promised that Iran would leave the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, if the U.S. abandons the nuclear deal.
If U.S. President Donald Trump exits the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, We announced that we will exit NPT, Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons.
And the U.S. filmmaker Oliver Stone is currently in Iran, and he spoke with the media there about French President Emmanuel Macron's apparent U-turn on the nuclear deal.
I was particularly shocked last night to come back to the hotel room and see on television, Iranian television, your President Macron standing alongside President Trump, calling for a revision on the Iran deal. Couldn't believe it. And when I remember very well President Chirac, with great pride, when he said no to George Bush when he wanted to invade Iraq. And now to see this young man who doesn't have much of a sense of history or memory of the great traditions of France, we have to remember that Mr. Macron seems to be one of, like Mr. Sarkozy wants to stand alongside the Americans as a sign of French power.
And now let's have a look at some of the other stories making headlines across the world.
Hundreds of opposition activists in Madagascar have called for the president to step down on a fifth straight day of anti-government protest, in which at least 2 people have died. Protesters are against new electoral laws, which could bar some candidates from running in the upcoming presidential election. Thousands of South African Union members have marched in Johannesburg against the proposed minimum wage plan. The policy proposed by President Cyril Ramaphosa sets the minimum wage at $1.6 per hour and is due to be launched from May 1st. Ramaphosa sees it as a step to tackle labor instability and wage inequality, but labor unions say the figure is too low.
If you look at the tough condition workers face in terms of tax and inflation, it shouldn't be right that they are offered $1.6 per hour.
Armenia's crisis deepens as tens of thousands of people take to the streets after the opposition accused the government of refusing to negotiate a shift of power following the resignation of veteran leader Shers Sarkisian. Groups of pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli demonstrators took to the streets of Milan during celebrations of Italy's Liberation Day. Protesters waved Palestinian and Israeli flags as they confronted each other. Liberation Day has been recognized as a nationwide public holiday since 1946. To celebrate the end of Nazi occupation of Italy during World War II.
And finally, in Trinidad and Tobago, some good Samaritans came to the rescue of a leatherback turtle on the country's southwest coast. This video posted to social media shows villagers in Cedros using rope and good old elbow grease to help the turtle back into the water. They believe the turtle came ashore to lay eggs, but the tide went down before she got a chance to return to the sea. Nesting season lasts until August 31st. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but for these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at tellusyourtv.net/English. And join us on social media for additional stories on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sony Gray. Thank you so much for watching.